Father John had always been a man of deep faith, or so it seemed to his congregation. From the moment he entered the seminary, it was clear that he was destined for greatness. He was charismatic, a natural speaker with a voice that could move mountains. His sermons were nothing short of powerful, often leaving his listeners in tears. The church was always full, from the elderly parishioners to the young mothers and the youth who looked up to him as a role model. Father John was the only son of Chief Okafor, a respected elder in the village of Arochukwu. His father had always dreamed of having a legacy, and when John chose the priesthood, he reluctantly accepted it. But even as a child, there had been a strange tension between them. His father, a man who prized wealth and power above all else, could never fully understand his son's spiritual dedication. For many years, Father John kept his life simple and unblemished. He lived by the rules of the church: celibacy, chastity, and devotion. He believed he was called to serve, not just the people of Arochukwu, but anyone who sought salvation. He had a large following, and people traveled from neighboring villages just to hear him preach. Father John had become a local celebrity, a symbol of hope for the downtrodden. But as the years passed, things began to change. The once pure heart of Father John, guided only by faith, started to be clouded by temptation and desire. The very things he preached against began to call to him in ways he could no longer ignore. Father John's fall from grace began subtly. It started with small indulgences, things he could justify to himself. After long days of service, he would sneak into the local bar, just for a drink, nothing more. He knew the church forbade alcohol, but he rationalized it as his only escape from the pressures of his public life, and it felt good, better than he ever admitted to anyone. In private, he would often speak against the sins of alcohol and womanizing, warning his congregation of the dangers of indulgence. But the irony was not lost on him. As much as he railed against sins in his sermons, he found himself succumbing to it in his private life. His nightly drinks became longer and more frequent, and the guilt started to fade the more he drank. The first time he had an affair, it was with his cook, a young woman who had worked for him for several months. She was beautiful, vibrant, and eager to please. He had always been attracted to her, but when the moment came, it was not love he felt. It was something darker, something dangerous. The affair continued in secret. Father John paid her handsomely, making sure to keep the situation quiet. He convinced himself that it didn't matter. After all, he was doing so much good for the community, wasn't he? The next affair came with his cleaner, a shy young girl named Chika. She was barely out of her teens, innocent and impressionable. Her mother often sent her to go clean Father John's house. Father John had always been careful, never taking his flirtation too far. But then one evening, after another long sermon, he found her alone cleaning his room. It was the perfect opportunity. Father John took advantage of the little girl, even though it wasn't easy, but he was able to convince her, assuring her there is nothing wrong with making love. Besides, she will be blessed if she makes love to a priest. The little girl gave in, and Father John took advantage of her. The guilt gnawed at him for days afterward, but he silenced it with alcohol. Father John's affairs grew more frequent. The women he slept with began to multiply, each of them silenced with money and trust. And still no one knew the truth. He was untouchable, the Reverend Father John, the holy man who could do no wrong in the eyes of his congregation. But Father John's secret did not end there. Unbeknownst to anyone, he had another life, one that was even more dangerous. He had met a woman, Amara, in the city during one of his trips to his diocesan headquarters. She was beautiful, smart, and independent. It wasn't love, but Father John was drawn to her. The affairs grew quickly, and soon Amara found herself pregnant. Father John was careful. He rented an apartment in a secluded area far from the prying eyes of Arochukwu. He would visit her regularly, paying for her silence with a hefty sum of money, telling her that no one could ever know about their child. Amara gave birth to a son and later a daughter. Father John visited them secretly, but he made sure his new life was hidden from everyone. His public persona remained pristine, a model of virtue and piety. At night, however, he would slip away from his church duties to embrace a different world, a world filled with secret family dinners, hidden conversations, and the sound of his children's laughter. But keeping such secrets was never easy, and Father John knew the wars were closing in. Still, he convinced himself that he could control it. After all, he was a man of God. Surely his sins were temporary, and no one would ever find out. Father John's darkest secrets, however, came in the form of Sister Jane, a young and devout nun who had recently joined the convent. She was beautiful, kind, and like so many before her, completely devoted to her faith. At first, Father John viewed her as nothing more than a pure, unteachable woman of God. But as he spent more time with her, teaching, counseling, and sharing spiritual insight, a dangerous attraction began to grow. Sister Jane was different from the others. She was reserved, disciplined, and quiet. She had the grace of an angel. But behind her eyes, Father John saw something else, something wild, something that mirrored his own desires. The temptation grew stronger with every passing day, until one evening, when their conversation lingered just a little too long, they found themselves alone in the rectory and in the heat of the moment. Father John tried to kiss her, but she refused. Father John, who is already drunk, could not control himself, so he forced himself on Sister Jane. This is the beginning of a disease. Sister Jane became pregnant, and though Father John tried to convince her to keep it a secret, the weight of the situation bore down on them both. Sister Jane was terrified. She knew the church would never forgive such a sin, and she feared for her life and reputation. In a moment of panic, Father John did the unthinkable. He invited her to his house for a solution. He gave her a substance to induce an abortion, something he believed would resolve the situation. He told her it was for the best. What he didn't know was that the substance was far more dangerous than he had realized. Sister Jane died in agony, and Father John, in a moment of sheer panic, took her body to a secluded riverside and buried her under the cover of night. He thought he had covered his tracks. He was wrong. Sister Jane had confided in Sister Maria, her closest friend in the convent, about the pregnancy and Father John's involvement. Maria was devastated, but she knew the truth had to come out. She quietly gathered the courage to go to the police. The news spread quickly as Father John preached to his congregation one Sunday morning. The doors of the church suddenly flew open. Some police officers entered the sanctuary. and all eyes turned toward Father John. He froze. The officers were their faces grim, escorted him out of the church. The congregation watched in stunned silence as a priest, once their beloved leader, was taken in custody. Whispers spread like wildfire. What had happened? Why was Father John being arrested? At the police station, Father John was tortured physically and psychologically. His guilt weighed heavily on him, and soon he broke. He confessed to everything: the affairs with Sister Jane, the abortion, and the subsequent death. He even confessed to his other crimes: the affairs, the lies, the stolen church money. The police investigation uncovered the truth. Father John had used church funds to build a mansion in his village and purchased several properties in town. The public was horrified. The man who had once been a symbol of purity and righteousness was revealed to be a fraud, a hypocrite who had lived a double life. News of Father John's crime spread through the town like wildfire. His parishioners were in shock. Many refused to believe the truth, while others felt betrayed and heartbroken. The once popular priest who had led them in prayer now stood as a symbol of hypocrisy and corruption. In Arochukwu, his father, Chief Okafor, was devastated. He had always hoped that his son would bring honor to the family name. But now, Father John's action had torn their family apart. The community could never look at him the same way again. Father John's trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, and the public was unforgiving. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Sister Jane, the abuse of power, and the theft from the church. As he sat in his prison cell, Father John reflected on his life. The once pure man of God had fallen from grace. In the cold, damp prison cell, Father John sat with his head bowed. The weight of his sins heavier than the stone walls surrounding him. The trial had been a blow, the details of his confession seemingly echoing in his ears like a constant drumbeat. The man who had once stood on altars delivering sermons that stirred the souls of the congregation now sat in shame, stripped of his dignity, his name tarnished beyond repair. But it wasn't just the loss of his priesthood that plagued him. It wasn't the years of imprisonment ahead of him or the disgrace that he had brought upon his family. It was the deep gnawing regrets for his choices he had made, the betrayals he had committed in the name of power, lust, and self-interest. The once pious man who had sworn to dedicate his life to God was now a mere shadow of himself, wrestling with the ghosts of his actions. In the first few weeks of his imprisonment, Father John spent many long nights staring at the ceiling, asking himself how he had fallen so far. How had the humble part of a priest, a servant of God, degenerated into his sordid, selfish existence? Was it the fame that had gone to his head, the adoration of his congregation, the endless flattery from women who adored him? Or was it simply the temptation that had always been there, lurking in the shadows waiting for him to sleep? His thought drifted to Sister Jane, the woman whose life he had stolen. He couldn't erase the image of her face from his memory, the look of fear in her eyes as he handed her the abortive substance, the helplessness she must have felt as the poison took hold. Despite the distance of months, the weight of her death pressed on his chest like an iron bar, and yet he had buried it all, literally and figuratively, in the silence of that lonely riverside. He had thought it was over, that no one would ever know. But Sister Maria had known, and now the whole world knew. The police investigation had now only unraveled his illicit affairs, his thefts, and his involvement in Sister Jane's death. But it also brought to light many of the other secrets Father John had buried over the years. He had manipulated the Christians' funds, the church funds, using them to fund his lavish lifestyle. His mansion in Arochukwu, the properties he had bought, the money he spent on his secret family, the money that should have been used to serve the people had been squandered for his own selfish desires. In prison, Father John found himself visited by an unlikely figure, Father Michael, a fellow priest from the same diocese. Father Michael was one of the few who had not turned their back on him completely, though many had. He had been a mentor to Father John during his early years in the seminary, and though he was devastated by the scandal, he still saw a man who deep down was capable of redemption. Father Michael's visits became a small thread of light in Father John's otherwise dark existence. They would sit together in the dimly lit room, talking about the old days, the teachings of Christ, and the path to salvation. Father John would listen in silence, occasionally offering a whispered prayer, though he wasn't sure if he believed in redemption anymore. He had crossed a line that even God might not be willing to forgive. Redemption isn't easy, John, Father Michael would say quietly, but it's never beyond reach, not for anyone. Father John would reply bitterly, "How can I seek forgiveness, Father? I killed a woman, I destroyed lives, I betrayed everything I was supposed to stand for. What's left for me?" Father Michael would not reply with easy comfort. Instead, he would look at him, his eyes filled with a knowing sadness. "It's not for us to determine who is beyond redemption, my son. Only God knows that. But you must do the hard work of atonement. It's not a matter of how many prayers you say, but of how you live with the consciousness of your actions." Father Michael's word would echo in his mind long after the conversations ended. What could atonement look like for a man like him? He had lost everything: his priesthood, his reputation, the love of his father. His only remaining option was to face the consequences, to accept whatever punishment the world had in store for him. Back in Arochukwu, the fallout from Father John's crimes continued to shake the village to its core. His father, Chief Okafor, had been publicly humiliated. For a man who had built his life around honor, tradition, and status, the scandal had been a devastating blow. His son, the one he had hoped would carry on the family name with pride, had instead brought ruin to everything he had worked for. At first, Chief Okafor had refused to believe the accusations against his son. He had held out hope that there had been some mistakes, some misunderstanding. But as the evidence mounted, Father John's confession, the testimonies of the women he had abused, the police investigation, it became impossible to deny the truth. One day, Chief Okafor gathers his closest family members in the large, open courtyard of their compound. He was a broken man. He had to speak to them. He had to address the shame that had fallen upon their names. "My son, my only son, has brought dishonor to our family," Chief Okafor began, his voice hoarse and strained. "I have lived my life to see my family rise, to see my name respected. But now I find myself the father of a man who had done unspeakable things. How do I answer to the elders? How do I face the community? They know what he did. How can I explain that? His elder brother, Nnamdi, a proud man who had always supported his nephew, spoke next. The truth is that we must confront it. We cannot hide from it. We cannot pretend our blood is any different from anyone else. We are not immune from failure. The conversation continued in his vein, but there was no clear resolution. Chief Okafor, despite his position in the village, felt powerless. He could no longer protect his son from the world. The name of Okafor was now synonymous with disgrace. As the months passed, Father John continued to wrestle with his conscience. His public disgrace was complete, but there was something deeper gnawing at him. The realization that he would never be able to erase the pain he has caused, the families he had betrayed, the lives he had ruined, the countless hours of trust he had destroyed. The turning point came one evening, during one of his solitary nights in the prison cell. The weight of guilt and regret was almost unbearable, and for the first time, Father John truly questioned his faith. He had built his life on lies, and now those lies had destroyed him. Could he still believe in a God who would forgive him after all he had done? And then, in the silence of his cell, something changed. It wasn't an epiphany or a sudden divine revelation. It was simply the quiet acceptance that his journey had come to an end. The mistakes could never be undone, but he could still seek some measure of peace, if not from the world, then from himself. Father John began writing letters to those he had wronged, to Sister Maria, who had exposed his crimes, to the women whose life he had wrecked, to his father, Chief Okafor, begging for forgiveness, and most importantly, to Sister Jane, the woman whose life he had taken. It was in those letters that Father John found the only kind of redemption that he could grasp, the courage to confront his actions and acknowledge their consequences. He had spent so many years running from his sins, hiding behind his position as a priest, but now he realized it was time to face them, no matter how painful. And as he wrote, he finally found some semblance of peace. Father John's final days in prison were marked by a quiet resignation. He was no longer the powerful figure who once stood before crowds, commanding reverence and awe. He was simply a man who had made terrible mistakes and was now paying the price. The letters he wrote were never delivered, but in his heart, he knew that writing them was a small act of redemption. The world may never forgive him, but at least he could face his own reflection without the heavy burdens of lies. And as he sat in his cell, alone with his thoughts, he whispered a final prayer, not for absolution, but for peace. Father, forgive me for I've sinned. Years later, Father John's story would be told as a cautionary tale, one of power, temptation, and the dangers of living a double life. His name, once revered, would be forgotten, but the lessons learned from his fall would linger in the hearts of the people of Arachukwu and beyond. And though Father John never found redemption in this world, perhaps in another, he would find the peace he so desperately sought.